The morning after Vulcanalia always dragged, but today felt like I was wading through a river of stale wine. My head pounded, and I leaned heavily against the counter of the Thermopylae, one hand idly scratching Zeus's ear. My faithful, black-furred friend wagged his tail, eyes bright, entirely unaffected by last night's chaos. I, on the other hand, could hardly keep my eyes open, let alone remember half of what had happened. In all fairness, I wasn't the only one with a bad hangover. This was one of the ones where the whole city stood together. "Rough night," came Icarus's voice from behind the counter, as steady and comforting as the scent of fresh bread he was slicing. I looked up at him, blinking against the morning light that streamed in through the door. "Rough doesn't even cover it," I replied, managing a lazy grin as I met his gaze. "If only you'd been there, might have kept me out of trouble." Icarus smiled, his cheeks flushing faintly. He glanced away, focusing on a spot on the counter as he wiped it down. As always, he was immune to my charm in a way I'd never encountered before. It didn't matter how I played my words or what stories I told. He never bent, never faltered, never even leaned in to listen closer like others did. I suppose it's time I admit something. Convincing people of things, whether it's small suggestions, instructions, or even far-fetched ideas, has always been as easy for me as snapping my fingers. It's more than just charm. It's a power I've had as long as I can remember. A few words here, a gentle nudge there, and people just agree with me. Maybe it's my voice, or something in my gaze, but whatever it is, it's always worked. Well, on everyone but Icarus, apparently. Just how strong is this ability? I didn't fully know since I had nothing to compare it to. But I never had to work. I never needed or wanted anything. I was able to masquerade in Pompeii as the son of a rich businesswoman from Athens. It was strong enough to stop most suspicion before it rose and to erase all doubts which did. Behind me, a man cleared his throat loudly. "That dog shouldn't be in here," he said, eyes narrowed on Zeus, who wagged his tail innocently. I took a breath, locking eyes with him. "Ah, but I need him," I said, as if I were explaining something obvious. "Zeus keeps me grounded. Don't you see? He's practically part of me." The man's brows furrowed for a split second, but I could feel the shift, see the resistance dissolve. His shoulders relaxed, and he nodded as he looked away, his annoyance all but gone. Turning back to Icarus, I caught him watching the exchange with a slight smile. He raised an eyebrow but said nothing. I gave him a lazy grin and shrugged, knowing he didn't see what I truly just did or what I was capable of. He smiled, but I knew he'd stay as oblivious as ever, entirely out of reach of my abilities. And yet, maybe that was the thing that drew me to him most of all. The one person around who saw me as I was, without any persuasion at all. A day passed, and by then the festival was swept away by new gossip and the steady hum of daily life. But something was different. I could feel it, like the air held a strange weight, a kind of tension hovering over everything. At times it felt difficult to breathe. I was sitting at the Thermopylae again, enjoying the quiet morning with a small bowl of olives because I hated figs. Zeus at my feet when I noticed the whispers floating around the room. A woman nearby crossed herself, muttering to her friend about the latest sounds that seemed to come beneath her home, each louder than the last. She talked about how her neighbour's dogs wouldn't stop barking, and how some chickens had stopped laying eggs altogether. "An omen from the gods," her friend said, voice low with fear. "Something terrible is coming." I rolled my eyes, trying to ignore the anxiety prickling in the back of my mind. Pompeii had its quirks, sure, but strange happenings weren't rare in a town that thrived on superstition. Still, the whispers grew, and I couldn't shake the feeling that maybe there was something to it all. Even Zeus seemed restless, ears flicking at every passing noise. By the time Icarus brought me my soup and bread, I was already on edge. He noticed, of course, Icarus had a way of looking at people like he could see right through whatever walls they built up, though it seemed no one could come close to getting past his. "You're quieter than usual," he observed, setting the plate in front of me with his usual cheerful smile. "Already feeling better?" "Surprisingly, yes," I joked, though my heart wasn't quite in it. I glanced around, lowering my voice. "Have you been hearing all these rumours about signs and omens?" Icarus chuckled, brushing off the question with a wave of his hand. "Superstition. People will see what they want to see, especially when they're bored. Don't let it bother you, Eros." He was so unbothered, his smile so easy, that I felt my own worries settle a bit. He was probably right. The townsfolk always find something to fret about. And yet, there was still that persistent, nagging feeling, and Zeus wouldn't relax. "If it did bother me," I said, "would you run off with me?" I meant it as a joke, half-hearted as it was, but something in my tone must have struck him. He stopped mid-laugh, blinking in surprise before the amusement returned to his face. "Sure," he said, "like you'd ever be happy with just me." I couldn't help but feel a pang of disappointment. "Well," I said, trying to cover my nerves with a grin, "if you change your mind, the offer stands." Later that evening, after I'd heard the latest round of unsettling rumours, I made my way back to my modest home on the outskirts of town. Again, for a moment, I thought it was even harder to breathe. I shook my head, telling myself I was being paranoid, but deep down, I knew it was more than that. That night, as I lay in bed with Zeus curled beside me, I couldn't sleep. When it came to Icarus, I was left wondering, how could I convince someone so rooted in this life to follow me away from it? The next day, the late afternoon sun filtered through the trees as Icarus, and I strolled through the woods on the outskirts of Pompeii. The sky was a deepening shade of gold, and the air was cooler now, a reminder that the year was winding down. Zeus trotted ahead, his black fur blending with the shadows as he darted back and forth in pure canine delight. It wasn't often I got to steal Icarus away for a few hours. Between his shifts at the Thermopolia and caring for his grandfather, he rarely had time to wander. But today, he'd agreed to join me, and we had made our way to a quiet grove where we could be alone, away from the noise of the city. I was happy just walking beside him, listening to the calm of the woods and sneaking glances at his profile. "I don't understand why you don't leave the city more often," I said, nudging him playfully. "With a view like this, it's a shame to stay cooped up." He shrugged, giving me a soft, sheepish smile. I smirked and didn't bring it up further. Better to let the comfortable silence settle between us as we walked on, the quiet interrupted only by the soft rustling of leaves and the occasional bird song. When we reached the small public pool nestled at the edge of the grove, we paused to dress down to swim. I couldn't help but look, and he caught me doing so. We swam for a few moments in silence. The noise of the few other people in the grand area was enough for the first few minutes. "So," I said, breaking the silence, "if you could go anywhere, where would it be? Even if you never actually left, where would you want to go?" He looked at me, a bit surprised by the question, but then a thoughtful expression crossed his face. "I don't know. Maybe I'd like to see Rome someday, or even the mountains. But I think I'd always come back to Pompeii. It's home." I nodded, understanding more than I wanted to admit. Just as I was about to reply, a strange sound rumbled through the air, deep and low like the growl of a beast. The ground trembled beneath us, a subtle shake at first, then stronger, sending small rocks tumbling into the pool. Zeus barked, his ears flattening as he darted to my side. I looked at Icarus, his face pale as he glanced around, the playful calm that had been there moments ago now replaced by worry. "Another tremor?" he asked, his voice uneasy. "This one felt different," I said, instinctively reaching for his hand. The shaking intensified, rippling the water into frantic waves as we steadied ourselves against the ground. Dust began to rise from the trees around us, and I felt a chill settle over me despite the warm air. "Maybe we should leave," I suggested, unable to ignore the sinking feeling in my stomach. If something's really happening, we shouldn't be here. No, he said, cutting me off, his hand tightening around mine. If there's danger, we should stay here. Listen to me, Icarus, I said, my voice low but urgent. If something serious is going on, we need to think about leaving. You, me, Zeus, even your grandfather. We could go today, right now. He looked at me, eyes wide with a mixture of disbelief and something else, a flicker of doubt that broke my heart to see. Eros, I can't just leave everything behind on a whim. I'd lost my job and wouldn't have anything to come back to. It's not a whim, I said, feeling the words catch in my throat. You'd have me. You could come back to me. I want you to come back to me. He looked into my eyes for several seconds. Then he shook his head, pulling his hand away from mine. Pompeii is my home, Eros. I won't run from it just because of some tremors. I've survived plenty before, and so has everyone else here. I didn't push further, but the fear I felt gnawed at me as we made our way back, the city looming in the distance, Mount Vesuvius casting an eerie shadow over us. The next day, Pompeii felt heavier. People moved through the streets with nervous energy, casting wary glances at the mountain and murmuring about the unusual tremors. The ground had shaken even harder during the night, waking the entire city, but Icarus seemed determined to act as if everything was normal. I found him at the Thermopolia, back to his usual routine of serving and joking with customers. As he worked, I kept an eye on him, catching his gaze whenever I could, hoping to spark the conversation we'd had in the woods. But each time, he deflected, his cheerful demeanour unwavering, even as worry flickered beneath his smile. When a lull finally settled, I seized the moment. Can we talk? He raised an eyebrow, playful as ever. We are talking. Fine, I replied, leaning closer. Let's talk somewhere else, somewhere quieter. He sighed, giving me a look that told me he knew exactly what I was going to say. Look, Eros, I know you're worried, but I can't just drop everything and leave. And what about my grandfather? We could bring him with us. Both of you could come, I pressed. You can't stay here if it means risking your lives. But he only shook his head, his face softening. You don't understand. This is all I've ever known. I'm not some rich kid from Athens with access to mother's purse. I took a step back and looked down. I'm sorry, he said. Frustrated, I looked away, struggling to keep calm. My ability, the one that allowed me to shape minds and bend wills, flared in my chest, until I remembered I couldn't use it to convince him otherwise, no matter how hard I tried. Before I could say anything, Kevin, a regular patron who often lingered, burst in. His face was drawn, sweat beading on his brow. Did you all hear? The spring outside the city has gone dry overnight. Not a drop left. A murmur rose from the few remaining patrons, and the colour drained from Icarus's face. Dry? He repeated, voice barely audible. That spring has never run dry. I felt a shiver creep up my spine, and even Icarus's confident facade wavered. He looked at me then, a glimmer of fear in his eyes, and I reached out to steady him. We need to leave, Icarus, I whispered, making my voice gentle but firm. I don't have a rich mother. I don't have parents at all. Before he could respond, another quake struck. This one was even fiercer, rattling the walls and sending dishes clattering to the floor. I stumbled but kept my grip on Icarus, pulling him close as the ground buckled beneath us. The customers bolted, shouting in alarm as the tremor gradually subsided, leaving a thick layer of dust in its wake. He clutched my arm, breathing hard, his eyes wide with panic. Finally, I thought he might be starting to see the urgency. But even then, his gaze drifted back to the door, to the city that had always been his sanctuary. Eros, I need to check on my grandfather, he said, voice shaky but resolved. Then let's go, I said quickly, releasing his arm and nodding toward the door. As we made our way through the city, a strange silence fell over us. The streets were nearly empty, with only a few souls hurrying about, glancing nervously at the mountain. I reached for his hand as we walked, but he barely seemed to notice, his mind far away. When we reached his grandfather's small house, the old man greeted us with a smile, unbothered by the chaos. Icarus knelt by his side, checking him over and speaking in hushed tones, reassuring him that everything was fine. Watching them, I felt a pang of envy. Icarus's world was simple, rooted in love and loyalty to his family and home, but I couldn't bear the thought of losing him to a place that seemed ready to crumble. After a while, I took a deep breath and knelt down beside him. "We don't know what's coming. Please, let's leave before it's too late." He looked at me, torn, and for a moment I saw that flicker of doubt again, the same one I'd seen by the pool, and I held my breath, hoping against hope that he'd say yes. But he only shook his head slowly. "I'm sorry. This is my home. I can't just run from it, even if it means—" He didn't finish the sentence, and he didn't need to. His answer was clear. He was bound to Pompeii, and I was bound to him. But before a minute could pass, the world began to shake. The floor beneath us trembled violently, dust fell from the ceiling, and screams could be heard near and far outside. "Icarus!" I shouted, grabbing him by the wrist and holding him safely against the doorway. "We have to go now." "But grandfather—" His eyes flicked to the door, as if he could already see the people running the streets, frantic, panicked. Another violent tremor rumbled through the city, and the ground beneath us cracked open, sending a wave of panic through the streets. People were pushing past us, making their way toward the exits, but there was no time to waste. I grabbed Icarus's hand, and he finally was ready to let go. Icarus stepped forward, his heart heavy with a conflict I could feel in every step. "Grandfather, we can't stay. We have to go now." His grandfather nodded, his expression firm but warm. "I know, my boy." Tears welled in Icarus's eyes, but he nodded, clenching his jaw as we turned toward the door. "We'll find a way," he whispered. "We'll find a way." I took Icarus's hand once more, this time with a firmness that would not be shaken. "Let's go." We raced through the streets of Pompeii, the world around us falling apart. More tremors followed, stronger than ever, and the air grew thick with ash, blotting out the sun. We ran as the city crumbled, people fleeing in all directions. I could hear the distant rumblings, and still I couldn't tear my eyes away from Icarus. He was alive. He was still there. He was with me. When we finally made it to the outskirts of Pompeii, we rested together in the field, gasping for air, watching the smoke and ash rise like a wall around us. "We made it," Icarus whispered, his voice raw but filled with relief. I could barely catch my breath, but I nodded. "We're safe, but we have to keep moving. We can't stop." He looked over at me, his face streaked with ash, but his eyes full of something I hadn't seen before, something fierce, something full of love. "We'll make it," he said with quiet determination. "Together." And I believed it. I believed him. By the end of the next day, Pompeii was gone. The days following the eruption were filled with nothing but ash, smoke, and endless uncertainty. The world had shifted under our feet, and the city we once knew had seemed so alive, so vibrant, was reduced to a smouldering graveyard. We didn't know what the future would hold, but as the ashes rained down around us, we understood that we'd left everything behind. The escape from the city wasn't easy. We had to navigate through fields choked with smoke and ash, our lungs burning with each breath. But we had one thing that kept us moving: each other. Icarus, his grandfather, Zeus, and I had become a unit, an unbreakable force against the destruction of everything we once knew. After what felt like an eternity, we reached the coast. The town was still miles away, but at least the worst of the eruption was behind us. We found shelter with some of the survivors who had fled, but the relief of escaping the destruction couldn't dull the ache in my heart. It felt as though a part of me had died along with the city, a part of me that had been tied to the streets, to the buildings, to the warmth of the sun as it sets over the bay. Weeks later, I sat beside Icarus one evening, as the last vestiges of sunlight flickered on the horizon. He had his arm wrapped around me, and Zeus lay by our feet, his tail thumping softly against the ground. "I think about the city," Icarus said, his voice soft. "I think about what could have been, what we could have had, if things had been different." I didn't need to ask what he meant. I knew. We both knew. We had found each other, and yet the city that brought us together was now gone. We were left with nothing but the remains of our old lives, and the hope that we could build something new, even in the shadow of destruction. "We'll never be the same," I said, my voice quiet. "But maybe that's okay. We're here, together. That's all that matters now." He nodded, resting his forehead against mine. "I know. It's just hard to leave it behind, to leave it all behind." I took a deep breath, feeling the weight of everything that had happened, but also the lightness that had begun to take root in my heart. "We survived," I said, "and as long as we have each other, we'll keep going, we'll keep living." He pulled me closer, his lips brushing against my temple. "And we'll make new memories, better ones, together." I smiled, feeling the warmth of his embrace seep into my bones. As the stars began to appear in the sky, I let out a long breath, feeling the night air cool my skin. It had been a long journey, but it wasn't over. Our lives had just begun. Zeus shifted beside us, and I looked down at him, seeing his tail wag lazily. He looked at me with those warm, trusting eyes. We were no longer just survivors. We were a family, and no matter what happened, we would make it through. Our old lives might have been lost, but in that moment I felt as though we had everything we needed to start again.